Hey there, this is Jay Frost speaking to you from the Frontlines of Social Good, where we explore the stories shaping the nonprofit and the philanthropic sectors. Thank you very much for joining us on week 2 of this new series. We're going to cover some record-breaking fundraising milestones, transformative gifts, and a loss felt across the social justice world just yesterday. We'll also examine the challenges of nonprofit governance, highlighted by the controversy surrounding OpenAI and the implications, which we'll be discussing with one of our guests who will show us a better path to making sure we work successfully with our leadership. Let's begin here. We'll start with a record-breaking achievement. According to MarketWatch, President-elect, or now President, Donald Trump, the inauguration committee raised $250 million, the highest total ever for a U.S. presidential inauguration. Major donors included Meta, Amazon, and Apple, each contributing $1 million. You probably also saw quite a bit of news coverage about the cryptocurrency sector. Ripple led the sector with a $5 million donation, highlighting tech and crypto's growing political influence. Observers suggest that these contributions may aim to align with anticipated regulatory changes under the new administration. Then across the country, in Cleveland, University Hospitals Because of You campaign has raised now over $1.5 billion, according to Newswise. This ambitious campaign focuses on advancing pediatric care, cancer treatment, and community health, bringing UH closer to its $2 billion goal. The St. Louis Symphony Orchestra has raised $150 million toward its $155 million goal to renovate Powell Hall. As reported by symphony.org, the historic venue will gain a 65,000 square foot expansion with new rehearsal and educational spaces. Completion is expected this year. In Montana, the University of Montana received a $9.4 million gift from the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, as noted by Philanthropy News Digest. The funds will establish an institute for positive education and provide scholarships to retain educators in Montana schools addressing both K-12 education and behavioral health needs. In San Diego, CureBound awarded $8.25 million to 17 cancer research projects, targeting breakthroughs in 15 cancer types. Since 2013, CureBound has granted more than $43 million to local institutions, including UC San Diego and the Salk Institute. Turning to individual philanthropy, Jeff Atwood, co-founder of Stack Overflow, pledged to donate half of his wealth within 5 years, starting with $1 million gifts to 8 nonprofits, including PEN America and Team Rubicon. Cecile Richards, that's a name I'm sure you know, the former president of Planned Parenthood and a towering figure in the fight for reproductive rights, passed away just yesterday at the age of 67. According to AP, Richards succumbed to glioblastoma, a form of brain cancer. Over her 12 years leading Planned Parenthood, she dramatically increased the organization's reach and donor support. Even after stepping down in 2018, she co-founded Supermajority to empower women voters. Former President Biden, awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2024. Finally, we turn to a growing controversy involving OpenAI, and a company I'm sure you know through, of course, ChatGPT, which is on many of our desktops today. They were founded in 2015 as a not-for-profit to ensure that artificial intelligence would benefit humanity. According to Axios and TechCrunch, OpenAI's transition to a, quote, capped profit model in 2019 has drawn sharp criticism for potentially prioritizing investor returns over public benefit. A co-founder, Elon Musk, also in the news for his work in several companies and, of course, co-founding OpenAI, has filed legal action accusing the organization of abandoning its original mission and engaging in anti-competitive practices. OpenAI has defended the transition as necessary to secure funding for innovation, but the debate highlights a deeper issue, one we have a chance to discuss today. That's how mission-driven organizations navigate the tension between financial sustainability or growth and maintaining core values. It's a challenge not just for nonprofits, but obviously for-profit companies as well. But today, we have a chance to discuss this in detail with a friend of the sector and a friend of the program. That is, of course, Brian Saber. Brian is, among many things, of course, the man behind Asking Matters and the author of 2 books in the sector, including one released just last year. And Brian, it's great to have you back and to talk a little bit about, of course, leadership generally and about boards specifically, and this issue about whether or not we can grow organizations successfully without giving up the missions that are supposed to sustain our work. Brian, welcome.
It's always great to be here, Jay, and I congratulate you on this new format, and I'm glad to be here early on in the year and in the format. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. You've got your book right behind you. So now we can see that's Fundraising for Introverts. But there's a lot more to you, of course, than just taking the bag off your head in these settings. So maybe we can start with that. Can you talk a little bit about your work and working with boards generally, and especially this issue about moving from transactional to relationship-based?
Sure. Well, I've been in the nonprofit sector 40 years this spring. And my third job early on, I was an executive director of a teeny organization, and I was responsible, managing up to the board and getting the board to fundraise in addition to doing that myself. And everything I've done since has involved the board, whether I've been a director of development, an executive director, and such. And about 15 years ago, as you know, Jay, I stopped after 25 years and started Asking Matters because specifically to address the issue of boards and their role in fundraising and how difficult it was for them to do it. It's not easy for anyone to do it. I mean, what I do teach is those of us who do it for a living, we do it for the same reason board members do it, because we care and we want to make a difference. Very few of us grew up saying, oh, I want to be a fundraiser when I grow up. It's the only thing I want to do, right? We do it because that's where we can make an impact. So it's hard for us as staff, but we end up getting a lot of tools, and we're not going out to people in our networks. We're going out to the donors of the organization and the prospects of the organization. For board members, they don't have the training. They are asked to look at their circle of influence and figure out who they might be able to bring to the organization. And it's a pretty treacherous path, actually. And so we developed the asking styles, which I'm sure many on here know about, to help people understand who they are in building relationships, because relationship-based fundraising is so important. It is so much healthier than this transactional fundraising. We can talk about the difference there. It is what moves organizations ahead in the long run. As a matter of fact, no organization gets to be really, really big without building relationships with donors that lead to significant ongoing giving that can often end in a planned gift. And most of the money comes from individuals in the United States. So you need to be focused on on relationships, though you have to with institutions as well. So, and you mentioned some of these extraordinary transformative gifts at the beginning, and none of them came from a direct mail letter. You know, once in a while, there are great stories of sending out a letter and getting some whopping gift from someone, but those are few and far between, which is why you hear about them. Most of these big gifts come from building relationships. And when we ask our board members to be involved in fundraising, what we should be doing is we should be asking them to be involved in building these relationships. But what we end up doing is saying, okay, we need money today. Who are you going to ask? Who are you going to bring to the gala? Who are you going to send an end of year note to, and such? And it all ends up being very transactional. And it adds to this whole nature of transactional fundraising. I mean, when people look at the list of organizations they've given to any year, you see all these little gifts you made where you really don't have any investment there. They don't know who you are. And you end up giving most of your money where you don't even care. right? Because it's just being spread around, and it all feels a bit transactional, and I think it's really hurting the nonprofit world. And it's came back to the boards. It's hurting our ability to get our boards to do this work.
Before we jump into the mechanics of that difference between doing it with the one way or the other way, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on why it seems like we are driven so much about the money. I mean, it might seem obvious, but
Yeah.
on the other
Well,
hand, um, we started with this OpenAI discussion. They presumably need money in order to build these big artificial intelligence tools. What is it about many of our organizations that they feel, no, we just need more? Is it that they're really serving a need, or is there something else, some other dynamic that ends up feeding this
no, I do think it's a need. I look, we could go back to Dan Palota's book, Uncharitable. And for years, one of the things that galls me is when people in the for-profit sector will, tell us in the nonprofit sector how to do things. And you're not being efficient and you're not doing this. But we've been starved for funds. We do everything on a shoestring from the beginning. People like to look at one or two really big organizations and, oh, look how much they're paying their executive, or look, they seem to be spending a lot on overhead. They have no idea how much we do for so little. In the for-profit world, right, you can make a couple of cents on a dollar and spend the rest on expenses, whereas they want it to be just the opposite way with us. And where that leaves most organizations is in a constant battle every year to meet the budget because we're trying to do as much as we can. We're also being asked to do more constantly and to document it and have results. So the public it keeps pushing the bar. Oh, and now we have to be, on top of DEI, and we're supposed to lead it, and we're supposed to do all these things without proper resources, and no business can do it without proper resources. So our staff are in this position constantly of having to knock on every door and push for gifts and push their board members to get gifts in this year just to make the budget. Because when I mean everyone, for profits, not for profits, we all have to make a budget, and we have to we have to project for things and say, well, we think we'll sell 100 widgets this year, right? And we have to say, okay, well, we think we're going to get money from all these different organizations, but it's much harder, and individuals, but it's much harder to predict that than it is the demand for product, let's say, in the marketplace, where there are these long trends. For us, every year is up and down because we're at other people's whims in terms of their charitable endeavors and so many other things. So, so we set a budget for the year, because we have to employ people and such, with very little cushion. We push to try and have reserve funds and such. Very hard for most organizations in the United States to get to that point. And we're crossing our fingers that we'll get to the end of the year. And often we're on a calendar fiscal year and we're getting a lot of money in the fourth quarter. So and I understand some businesses are dependent on Black Friday and Cyber Monday and such. I get that too. But we're in a precarious position because if we make too much money, then some people won't want to give us because they'll think we're flush, and so our budgets often have zero margin. And right, if a company's trying to make 10% and they end up at 8%, they made money. If we're trying to break even and we're short 2%, we lost. And I think people are just so unaware of that dynamic. And we in the nonprofit sector are so compelled to do good, that we'll do it under any circumstances.
Let
And
me let me ask you about that, about that from the perspective of relationship-driven fundraising. So, from one perspective, it helps us, I'm sure, to sustain revenue, which is really important, and even to attract large gifts because the relationships are there. And I know you can talk more with us about that. But does it also address this issue of margins? Because if we are trying to grow, but our margins are always, like you just said, at 1 or 2%, as they are in healthcare, it doesn't necessarily address the problem we have of operating hand to mouth. when we are developing long-term relationships, does that give us a little more flexibility in terms of the ability to program according to vision, not just, the next quarter?
Yeah, well, to the extent that our fundraising is relationship based, we can count on it more because we're having direct conversations and we know that the intention of the donor is to continue funding us and possibly to a greater extent. I whenever I train, one of the questions I ask is, I ask people, what's the longest number of consecutive years you've made a gift to any one organization? And people say 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I mean, and for the 40s and above, it's either their place of worship or where they went to school or something. And I say, that's what we need, right? We need a big pool of donors we can depend on every year. And we can only get that way by building a relationship, right? There was a relationship originally between me and my alma mater, which is why I give every year. But there are other organizations where that relationship's been built. And I feel a sense of ownership, responsibility, whatever between to the organization and or people in it. And that gives us something to build a budget on, just like brand loyalty, right? And that comes from a relationship you've built with a product or service over the years. And the more we can do that, the better we can plan. And because then we can say, okay, well, we're sure we're getting, here's the 80% we know we can depend on. We just need this smaller piece to come in this year, whereas often most of it we can't depend on.
So when it comes to this transactional versus relationship based,
Yeah.
do you see a trend occurring? I mean, are we seeing the sector move more and more towards one or the other? And why? And if so, why?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, as you know, individual contributions are what's happening for better and for worse, and it goes back to your announcement, is fewer people are giving, and those who are giving more because the wealth disparity has gotten so great. And it's wonderful that people are giving back, and I will never poo-poo anyone who makes a huge gift. Mackenzie Scott and others are my heroes, really, because they don't have to do that, and they choose to, right? They're choosing to give away half their wealth or more and set a good example. It is problematic, as we see in so many ways in the country, to have wealth so concentrated, but we can't change that. Our smaller nonprofits, we have to go where the money is, and it does help us to do that. So on the other hand, we need to maintain our independence, and that can get troublesome if we have too few very big donors. I have an organization that is small, but and a handful of donors fund most of it. It's great, it's efficient, and it also can get a bit problematic, so you have to be careful. So you asked about the trends. I, Besides the concentration of wealth and the fewer but bigger gifts, I'd have to think about what those other trends are, and those are somewhat based on relationships, right? Those bigger gifts that people have the capacity and they're compelled to help on a grand level. But we're still, on the other hand, we do all this crowdfunding. Everyone and his mother does a GoFundMe or something, and people feel like they're getting hit up endlessly. Right now, the truth of the matter is very few people are getting asked, Jay, would you consider sitting down with me to talk about a gift to this organization you already care about? So I think there's a lot of room for that, and people want to develop relationships. So they're hungry. I think some donors are hungry for that type of relationship. But most of what most people get is this transactional. I'm, being asked every day, getting the letters in the mail all the time, getting phone calls, getting texts, getting crowdfunding through their social media. and it can feel like a barrage. So I think there are a bunch of trends happening at the same time, better and worse, you know.
And you've talked about this a lot in terms of the asking styles. I know in the past to try and get people to match up or marry, their essential personality type to donors, so they can have a comfortable conversation and advance those relationships.
Yes.
When you've talked with boards, and you do a lot of board trainings, when you've talked with boards, what do you see as the major impediment to going from this kind of let's send out a barrage of email
Yes.
to let's sit down and have a conversation? And how do you help them to get from that place
Hmm.
into the place where they need to be?
Well, by the time I work with a board, the board has been doing a lot of this transactional fundraising, stepping on relationships, feeling really awkward about who they're asking, and the swapping of gifts with friends and family and so forth. So trying to um, trying to get them to see that it can be a better experience is the first step. And that part, and there are many pieces to that. One piece is to try and get some agreement with the organization. We're going to do less of this transactional fundraising. We're really going to try and move away from it. Whatever the short-term pain is, let's start to do it better. We're going to stop pushing board members to hit up everyone in their network, if in fact they can be more helpful with the organization's prospects and donors. So many of the people who give to our organization aren't getting the time and attention that would maximize their gifts. And because the executive director, the one development director, whatever, don't have the time to spend with each of these donors. And so I try and get the organization to understand it would be more worthwhile for the board members to work with the current donors of the organization instead of constantly trying to bring in new people. So so it starts with a change of perspective and a better understanding of where those best prospects and donors are. And I always say prospects and donors because prospects haven't given, but donor, where are the donors? And so, and I have to also work with staff to stop bullying the board to 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 do this work. I mean, so many of these benefits, these fundraising benefits, right? They rise or fall on the backs of the board members. And I come in and I say, okay, look, okay, great. You raised $150,000 and you had $40,000 worth of expenses. So now you're down to 110. But how much of that did the board itself give? And how much of it did it bring in through asking people to sit at tables, and now they are going to have to spend $250 for at each of their friends' benefits, and so now they're giving their money someplace else. And how much profit really is there? And now let's take all the time we spent, because I think staff also trying to make their budgets is on this in this it's a rat race, right? You're just spinning, and you don't stop to be strategic. So I've got to get the board to understand better, but the staff has to understand better as well. Um, because otherwise board members get burned out. They say, I've hit up everyone I know, and they feel so put upon by the work, it's not helping. So that's what I try to do to change the discussion we're having. And then they need to learn some tools. It's funny, I just was writing some copy this morning. Most board members actually don't know how to talk about this organization they love. We don't spend enough time helping them understand how to cultivate rather than to ask, how to open a door. We just send them out to slaughter. Often we do. It drives me nuts.
This is funny also, because there are many people who might listen to this conversation and say, "Oh, woe is me, the poor board members. Are you serious?" Because board members, they might think, have the power, the influence, the wealth. So why are we feeling sorry for them? They should go out there and raise more.
Michael Davidson, one of my great mentors who passed away 3 years ago Sunday, talked often about the role of board members, what it is and isn't, and what board members should feel they're getting out of this, and really understanding them as human beings, and being more holistic about what they bring to the table and all this. And this idea, we bring board members on because they're successful or they're leaders in the community or they're whatever, but it doesn't mean they can fundraise. Everyone will tell you that asking for money is the one thing they don't like doing in the world. Most people just don't like doing it. Um, and they're human beings like we are, whether they're more successful financially or in some other way. And it's not a question of, oh, poor board members. It's a question of, do you want board members who really are passionate and want to do everything they can and will stick around? Because if so, you can't make martyrs out of them. None of us should be martyrs. And if we're constantly asking board members to do even more difficult work for no money, Michael would talk about the cost benefit analysis, or the sales pitch. In a for-profit corporation, you're paid to attend, to be a board member. You're paid for each meeting. If it's a public company, you've got stock in the company, so you have a vested interest. And then we say, oh, but in the nonprofit world, we're going to ask you to come to these board meetings for free. They'll be in the evening, maybe when you'd rather be with your family, and then you got to join a committee during the day when you're working. We'll ask you, and we're going to ask you to give a gift. For the privilege of sitting on our board, you have to pay us. And if that's not enough, because that's such a great deal, we're going to ask you to then fundraise and ask other people for money, knowing that most people hate it. Isn't that fantastic? So if we're going to ask board members to do all this, we have to treat them well and respect this, and stop thinking everyone should be a martyr and everyone should just do everything for the sake of making the world a better place.
So if you were giving some practical advice, especially to smaller organizations where maybe the staff may or may not have that level of experience in dealing with these issues, but they also just don't have a lot of people to deal with these things. They see these big needs, and they're looking at their board. How can they both find a way for the board to be successful, but then give them the empathy and the respect that you just outlined is so essential to their success?
Well, they have to start looking at what I would call this major gifts program, this major gifts in 2 hours a week. As a matter of fact, I do this webinar for Charity How To, and I call it major gifts in 2 hours a week. If you only have this teeny amount of time, what can you do to get more relationship based in your fundraising? How can you focus on just a few people who can make a difference, and have your board involved in cultivating those relationships, right? So and it doesn't have to be on a big scale to start, but if you don't start that now, how are you going to get to that point anyway? So even if you're small, you should start to look at building some of these relationships, and the board can be really helpful because you have only X amount of time as an ED or a sole development officer, but the board is 10, 15 people, 20 people, each of whom could give you an hour or two a month. But I could also throw a huge wrench in this right now. Can I?
Please.
And say that I think we need we need the nonprofit community we need to stop building new nonprofits every time someone has an idea. We need we need we need our world to shrink in terms of number of nonprofits, and I think many should join forces to be bigger, healthier, steadier nonprofits. I face this in the theater community. I remember years ago, I'm sorry, I'm going to pick on Chicago, but I remember I was a speaker from, she was the head theater critic from the Sun-Times, joking, what happens when you put two actors together in a closet for an hour? You get a new theater company. Well, there are over 300 theaters in Chicago, and if anyone from there hears this, they're going to throw tomatoes at me, but I've always felt There aren't 300 some odd different artistic visions in Chicago for theater, and theaters could come together and 5 or 6 of them could put on a really solid season together and actually have their own space. And I see organizations that start this little program that really could have been a part of a bigger organization. And so that's exacerbating these issues. And I don't know how to deal with that. I'm just trying to I'm dealing with the quid pro quo and getting board members to do less of that. But one way is to have fewer organizations that are all stronger and have more resources
Right.
and can do more good work.
So Brian, just in kind of our last 30 seconds, tying this back to the original discussion about a big nonprofit, albeit totally different from most of what we're talking about here, certainly in the theater companies, organizations, when they grow, are often challenged by trying to remain aligned with their mission. And if they're trying to come together, then that kind of merger, that poses its additional challenge. So just as a quick note, what would you say, what advice would you provide to organizations that need to remain mission aligned while trying to maximize the donor experience and make sure that the board members still feel like they're appreciated and are in control because they are legally in control?
Well, it's interesting because I haven't seen that much mission creep or mission realignment in the hundreds of organizations I've dealt with. That to me hasn't been the biggest issue. So it's so interesting to hear that. What would I say to them? I'm actually a little flummoxed about that. I'm supposed to have some words of wisdom at the moment. I'm not sure because I don't think mission creep is the issue. I think scarcity of resources is. And look, I run a small business, and Jay, you and I have talked about my challenges, significant challenges that I have because I don't have all the skills, and I can't necessarily find all the skills, and it's hard to be small. You can be nimble when you're small, but it's hard to have what you need when you're small. So that so it's hard when you're small not to put that pressure on the board members coming back to the beginning. Um, and growth is painful. So
Thank you, Brian, for all of this, both for what you do, but also for being so transparent as you think about it and think about these boards. Really do appreciate you.
thank you, Jay. I'm delighted to be on, and I hope whatever I said will spark some more discussion in the field.
I'm sure it will. And
Yeah, thank you.
if for folks who are here, if you'd like to learn more about Brian and his work, you can of course go to askingmatters.com. You can learn about that, and you can see his 2 books, which you see pictured there, available for you both through that website, but also on Amazon and just about everywhere, I guess, right?
Yeah, everywhere. And really to start with this, we have a little quiz. It's free, and it's something I use with all the boards just to help people understand who they are so they can build relationships. Never forget how important relationships are, really.
Thanks so much. Good advice.
Thanks so much, Jay.
And now we're going to move on to our author segment. As you probably know, if you've been following, we have a lot of people who we've had the pleasure of talking with over the now 9+ years of the Philanthropy Mastermind series. So we wanted to make sure there was a dedicated space to talk with people, especially who were about to release their books. And our guest today to talk about that is Dave Raley, a consultant and thought leader in nonprofit innovation and the author of a new book, The Rise of Sustainable Giving. Now, just a word of warning, I have not read his book yet, and you haven't either, because it's not out. It's going to be out, I think, on February 4th. But in this book, I can tell you that Dave is going to delve into how organizations can adopt principles from successful subscription models to deepen donor relationships, create personalized experiences, build sustainable revenue streams. A lot of what we were talking about with Brian a moment ago, but now through the lens of a book that I'm sure will take us to a really, really good place in terms of developing some strategies, long-term strategies for transformational impact. So Dave, thank you so much for being with us today.
Jay, happy to be on the show. Happy to help just spread the message of a book that is about to be out. Thankfully, It's been fun doing that process because it's been good getting some early industry leader feedback, and so far so good.
And again, I want to make sure I have the title right. So was I correct in that? Do you have a subtitle or anything that I should
Yeah,
be?
The Rise of Sustainable Giving, world's longest subtitle. So you don't have, but I'll hit it, which is just how the subscription economy is transforming recurring giving and what nonprofits can do to benefit.
Well, I'm glad you read the full subtitle because it may be long, but it's important, not just to the book, but to all of us. So, what inspired you to draw that kind of connection between the subscription economy, and it'd be great for you to define that for us,
Yep.
and nonprofit recurring giving programs?
Yeah, for me, I remember the very first charity I ever worked with in a professional capacity. And it was an organization called Union Rescue Mission in Los Angeles. A lot of folks in the philanthropy sector would be familiar with URM. They are Los Angeles's largest social services charity and our oldest as well. And so, having grown up originally in Southern California, I was familiar with, even volunteered down on Skid Row and just got exposed to the need there. And Jay, the very first fundraising program I ever worked on was a monthly giving program for URM. This is
Huh.
20 years ago
Yeah,
this year.
those were not
And
that common then, really.
oh no, it was not that common. And I remember a couple things about it. It was a lot of work. So those were back in the check writing days. Pretty much 100% of our donors were check writers. I was the one putting out the 30, 60, 90-day lapse letters and all those things that I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with. So I remember it being a lot of work, but I also remember it just being candidly pretty frustrating because it was such a small percentage of the overall organizational revenue. I mean, it was single digits, low single digits, and it was hard work to grow it. Fulfillment wasn't great, and I left that experience feeling like, man, I wish there was more we could do, in the area of recurring giving. Fast forward over the last really decade, and this is where the subscription economy comes in. I started to notice my own personal consumption habits changing. This is about 12 years ago now. And about 10 years ago, started to speak about it in the industry like, hey, what are some lessons we might be able to learn from what's happening in this thing called the subscription economy that we may be able to apply to philanthropy? And early on, Jay, to your point, people were like, subscription economy, what does that mean? Could you define that? And I would say, well, like Netflix and Amazon Prime. And they'd be like, oh, okay, I get it, I get it. Today, I don't really have to define it most of the time because people are like, oh, yeah, I've got a million subscriptions. But to your point, really, the subscription economy is the rise of recurring ongoing relationships and transactions in every area of our lives, business, home, places of faith, workplaces. And I just wondered, this was in the early days, I just wondered how it might impact the way people think about their generosity. And yeah,
I wonder about this now because I've seen a lot of ads just recently uh, for apps that are they purport to help people remove subscriptions that they didn't realize they had. Have you run
oh
into
yeah,
this? And if so, how does that apply, if at all, to maybe a backlash that might be occurring in the general subscription economy? And I don't know if that's
absolutely.
happening in the nonprofit sector or not.
I don't know about the nonprofit sector, but I will speak to that. The average American today, Jay, you want to guess how many the average American subscriptions the average American
I have
has?
no idea.
12 subscriptions. Most people, stop after three, four, or five. In fact, they did a recent study and asked folks, how many subscriptions how many subscriptions do you have, and how much do you estimate you spend on an average month? The average American, Jay, underestimated how much they spent on subscriptions by $133 a month. That's $1,600 a year of subscriptions they didn't know they had. And so you've got apps like Rocket Money is probably the big one you're thinking of that actually will come in, plug into your bank account and say, oh, look at all these recurring subscriptions you have, including, by the way, your philanthropic giving is getting pulled into those reports.
Really? Okay.
So it is absolutely, we're seeing a convergence. And I think one of the things we've seen in the subscription economy, by the way, the average subscription oriented business over the last 12 years has grown 4 times faster than the general market. And so there's a group called Zuora, Zuora, and I interviewed their head of their institute. Her name's Amy Connery in the book to talk about what are some lessons we might be able to apply. And she's, fun fact, by the way, the person credited with coining the term SaaS, software as a service, which you know well, and a lot of our listeners are familiar with because we're all subscribed to some sort of software, whether it's our CRM or our, Netflix or our Microsoft, Office 365. And so that has just been an area that has really transformed. But what we've seen the last couple of years with subscriptions is this rise of just kind of like junk subscriptions. Like, let me see if I can trick you into a monthly subscription. And the reality is those businesses don't last because the vast majority of the value and the sort of profit, so to speak, from a subscription comes after that first transaction. And so those businesses basically come and go overnight. And there's an application in the fundraising space. In fact, Brian talked about it in your last conversation about the importance. I wrote it down of like we have to have a group of donors we can depend on every year, and it's getting away from those ups and downs. And 98% of the value of a recurring donor takes place after the first gift.
And this is to get them to stay. I mean, we could talk all about for a long time about getting them in the first place, and perhaps we should. But to get them to stay, what are some of the tips or the things that you talk about in the book to get people to stay with you after they've signed up?
The first thing that we talk about, and it comes again directly ported from the subscription economy, is what is your ongoing value proposition? Not only why should a donor give to you, and what is the need, and what are the consequences, and so on and so forth, but why is that important on an ongoing basis? If you think about music, I always like picking on music as an industry. If you would have told me, Jay, 10 years ago, hey, Dave, you should subscribe to the music company and give them money every month so you can access music, I would have said, no, thank you, Jay, because I've got in my case, it was an MP3 selection. Others would have had their CD collections or their tape collections or whatever, right? I'm like, no, I want to own my music. Why would I rent music from the music company? They'll just take it away if I stop paying. And yet today, I gladly send Spotify, I think it's $17.99 a month for a family plan, every month. Now, am I buying music essentially from Spotify? No. The reason I subscribe to Spotify is because it provides an ongoing value proposition. This morning, as I wrote my latest article, I listened to the Disney piano playlist, that I listen to when I write. My children will send me songs. I've made, playlists for my daughters, from their daddy. I discover music regularly using Spotify because it knows my taste, right? There's a reason I would give money to Spotify on an ongoing basis, and it's not renting music. Now, am I essentially renting music? Yes, but it's really about having that ongoing value proposition.
So what are the equivalents
Yep.
for a nonprofit? Or maybe you can give us a case study or two, because it's one thing with music. You're right. I think many of us have made this transition from I have to own it to I want it to tell me what I might want next, which is a very different sort of value proposition. But do nonprofits have the ability to do that? I mean, can we rely on people to say, yeah, the impact is really, exciting me? I mean, what's the equivalent of gamifying a nonprofit so we are constantly engaged and we want to keep giving every single month indefinitely?
Yeah, let me give you a couple examples that would be more historical, and then I'll give you some modern ones. So historically, really, there have been 3 kinds of recurring giving. And by the way, this dates back thousands of years. I did quite a bit of research for this book. Even though I've been a practical fundraiser and worked with a lot of charities, I went back into history, and honestly, the earliest recorded form of recurring giving dates back to the ancient Jewish people, and the idea of what they called first fruits, where in agriculture or in livestock, they would bring their 10% of their first fruits to the temple, and then the temple would distribute those to the poor and the widows and those sorts of things. So recurring giving's not new. um, Goes back thousands of years, but in the more modern era, we've seen really three kinds of recurring giving. Number one, I call it one-to-one. So that is your I give and a beneficiary receives. So child sponsorship would be an example of that. Staff support or missionary type support would be another example of that, where the donor and the beneficiary are connected in some way. Okay, so that's one model. Problem with that model, by the way, Jay, one of the problems with that model is that the vast majority of charities don't have the kind of program or infrastructure or delivery system to literally pair up donors and beneficiaries, either privacy concerns or just logistical issues. That brings us to the second type of recurring giving historically, which is what I would call membership, and that is the donor is at least partially the beneficiary of what the organization does, its programs, its services. Brian mentioned theater. Perfect example. The donor is giving altruistically, but also they're benefiting, right? Because there might be some networking or prestige, or even just discounted tickets, or assigned seats or stuff like that. So that's another wonderful type of recurring giving, and in some ways has a built-in ongoing value proposition, right? Because you're getting ongoing value literally from that gift. But again, there's a problem, and that is the vast majority of charities don't have the kinds of programs and infrastructure to actually deliver benefits directly to or indirectly to their donors. They're a humanitarian organization, they're a relief and development organization, they're a human services organization, and their donor is not their beneficiary in any way, shape, or form. So that leaves the third category, which I estimate is about 75% of all charities today. So if we take 1.5 million, registered charities in the US today, that's about 1.1 million charities are not membership, they're not one-to-one, they're historically been left behind. So let's go all the way back to Union Rescue Mission, to your question, and illustrate that. So what we did, and this is back in the day, was we actually pivoted the program from what was then called a meal a day program, because the idea was a meal, to distribute a meal with gifts in kind and volunteer hours, cost about $1. I think it was like $1.20 or $1.12 or something like that in the early days. Well, that math, $1.20 times 30 days is about $35. That made for a good monthly gift ask. But, and this is where that fulfillment rate really stunk, it was not an ongoing value proposition. It was like, would you give a meal today? And it's like, I mean, technically there are going to be meals needed tomorrow, but it wasn't human. It didn't have a relational connection, to Brian's earlier points, and it just wasn't compelling. So what we did was we pivoted the program, because the reality was 50% of the people coming to Union Rescue Mission for services at that time were women, children, and families. And so we created a program that was essentially a representative child sponsorship program. So completely anonymized, but we were going, your ongoing gift will make a difference for people like, and then we told Sarah and her son Elijah's story, and how you could make a difference in their lives on an ongoing basis. And then next month, we're going to tell you a new story of somebody who's working, who's being benefited from the program on an ongoing basis. In other words, we provided that ongoing value proposition. And so when we did that, we saw their fulfillment rates immediately go up, like literally overnight, from switching from the meal a day to a human focus and an ongoing need that was very tangible like that. to.
That reminds me of what Save the Children did once upon a time with letters from the field that were ostensibly written by or dictated by children who are the beneficiaries of their programs. So in a sense, they were also trying to make that connection to the personal story. It's interesting, though, that the stories are always changing, that rather than in that case, rather than saying, here's the family this week, and then here's how they are the next month and the next month, it's a different family each month. What is there an advantage to keeping it that dynamic versus allowing a donor to feel like they're a partner in the success of, let's say, one family? What's the dynamic there?
Well, that was more of just a practical reality because of the nature of homelessness and their programming. So it wasn't that one family was going to be in the program for longer than hopefully 6 months, I think was the high end. So that was just more of a practical consideration, as well as some of the privacy concerns. So I'm actually not against having some sort of ongoing sort of specific need like that. It just was practically not possible for them. But it really is, about creating that kind of ongoing, not just need, but connection to the charity. But you did ask, like, if 98% of the value is in after that first gift, then we need to look at how we're onboarding and welcoming people into these programs. So often onboarding either doesn't happen, you get your first gift receipt and then you get another one, or it's basically a glorified, 3-part email series and it's like they're onboarded, and it's like, if you looked at how much money and time subscription businesses spend on onboarding because they know all of the value is if you actually use the darn thing you just subscribed to, right? And so onboarding is key, as well as churn prevention. And I talk about this in the book. There's really 2 kinds of churn, and these are subscription terms, but they definitely apply involuntary churn and voluntary churn. So involuntary churn is the number one lost revenue source for charities, and that is when somebody's payment method declines. So you get an updated credit card, expiration date, new number. I had this happen to me, by the way, about a year ago while I was writing the book, Jay. So I personally got a new credit card from the bank because they said, "Oh, somebody stole your data." Go figure. Here's a new credit card, and I said, "I'm going to do this as an experiment. I'm not going to contact any of the charities that I give to because I'm going to see how many charities contact me." And we probably, I don't know, we give to probably about a dozen charities on a recurring basis. And Jay, within the first 6 weeks, we had one charity even reach out, period, and acknowledge there seems to be an issue with your payment process. And then we had another charity reach out a couple months later. But that, the math varies depending on what source you look at, but anywhere from 20 to 25% of payments churn on an annual basis, just simply because of credit card got updated and the donor didn't know it.
A lot of lost revenue, but also lost relationships because those relationships could potentially be major gifts. Plus, those are the advocates for the service in the same way that people might say, yeah, I really love Spotify. They're really going to say, I love this organization, or they won't.
Yep.
There's so much we could talk about here. Kind of as we wrap up, I know you've got a lot in the book, but is there one major takeaway that you think that is the reason why people, frankly, should read this and apply it in their shops?
It's very early on, and it's been fun to get some of the early feedback. Jay, I spoke at an event recently and did a preview of these are some of the core insights. And a leader came up to me after the talk, and because I cover a lot of ground in the book, by the way, and we talk about certainly why sustainable giving matters and what we can learn from the subscription economy. But part 3 of the book is a literal 7-step guide to designing and managing a thriving program. So I go all the way into just the practicals of churn prevention and stuff like that. And her name was Lisa, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, "Dave, I came away from your talk thinking we can do this." And I thought, what a simple statement. Like, the actual belief that you can actually raise recurring, growing, resilient revenue. So many charities, at least in my experience, up until the last couple of years, have just essentially written off recurring giving as a substantial part of their revenue. Everybody has recurring giving, don't get me wrong. Everybody has donors who choose to give on a recurring basis, but it's, again, usually a relatively small percentage. And so just the reality that recurring giving is more accessible to more charities than at any other time in history, literally, is, I think, the message that I want people to understand is if you're a part of that 75%, that 1.1 million charities that have essentially been left behind, not anymore. Look at what Charity Water has done over the last decade. And I know people kind of roll their eyes about Charity Water, but they don't get enough credit as far as I'm concerned with what they've done with recurring giving. If you would have told me, again, 10 years ago, hey, Dave, there's going to be an organization that's going to have 80,000 donors giving on a monthly basis for clean water as a lifelong fundraiser, I would have said, well, clean water is a great, like relief and development type of ask. It's a good disaster type of ask. It's like a one-time, like an impulse gift. Getting people to give on a monthly basis to clean water, though, for years, like that's going to be hard. Well, ask the 80,000 Spring members, if that's made a difference in their lives. And so I just want people to understand this is accessible. And then, yes, let's provide some very practical how to take advantage of it tips.
Thank you so much, Dave. Again, Dave Raley, author now of the February 4th release, The Rise of Sustainable Giving. And Dave, where can people find the book or find out more about you?
Easy place to go is just sustainablegiving.org. That will send you to my company's site, Imago Consulting. We also have a blueprint that we're about to put up that'll be a free download, 7 steps to growing a thriving sustainable giving program. Comes from the content in the book, but is a much more condensed version, just as a helpful thing for folks to be able to download. So that should be up here in the next week or two.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for sharing this and letting people know that it really is possible to stop neglecting the people who care. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Jay.
Now, folks, we're going to move on to a segment that we just, again, started just last week, but we think is a lot of fun. And we'd also like you to be able to participate in it in the future. This is an on-the-road segment, which means that right now we are sourcing videos from organizations like yours, organizations that are doing tremendous work around the country and around the world. We also in the future plan to be heading out to where you are in order to record these videos and tell your stories. But for right now, we want to encourage you to participate in this by reaching out to us, letting us know that you're there and that we can share your stories. This week, we want to share one from Escondido, California, which is, in fact, just in the last 24 hours on the front lines of the wildfires in California.
When Amelia first came into Interfaith, she had no idea where to start. It turns out she was actually living in a garage with her husband and her 2 adult disabled children.
Porque mi esposo solamente trabajaba, yo no podía trabajar por cuidar a los niños porque tengo 2 niños con discapacidad, entonces tendría que dedicarme solamente a ellos.
One of the main barriers that Amelia was facing was proving her income. Because she wasn't able to work, it was just her husband. So there's only one income that they were relying on. She didn't know that there was any resource out there that can help her get out of the situation that she was in through case management. One of the first things that we started working on is how can we get her to prove on paper that she has income, and how can we increase that income. She was able to apply for disability for both her children and was approved. We also provide move-in costs for our client. So that is, it could be either through deposit, first month's rent, or both. In this case, we were able to provide both for our client so that she could have a peace of mind when moving into her first apartment, because I know it's a really big step for them.
Interfaith no solamente nos ayudó con buscar esta vivienda, vino su equipo, el equipo de Interfaith, para amueblarnos nuestra casa. Lo que no nos esperábamos era también esa ayuda. Entonces vinieron y como pudieron, subieron todos los muebles hasta el segundo piso.
She was actually selected to receive a unit, and not just any unit. She was selected to receive a 3-bedroom unit.
Ya cuando vine y abrí la puerta, pues wow, fue una sorpresa muy grande al ver que no teníamos que empezar a comprar una mesa, una olla o una cama, sino que ya teníamos todo también gracias a Interfaith.
People at Interfaith out in Escondido, California, as I mentioned, are now probably trying to make sure that the services they provide are available to all the folks affected in that part of California. We wish them great safety and success. You can learn more about Interfaith on the web. That's Interfaith in Escondido, California. That's a wrap for this episode of Frontlines. I hope you'll join us again on Frontlines next week, when we're joined by Devin Thorpe, author and often podcaster as well, author of many books, including How to Make Money with Impact Crowdfunding. You can also join me Thursday of this week for How to Raise, our CFRE accredited training series, when this week, James Wisner, founder of the Kipos Group, provides a session on mastering donor retention, strategies to prevent and recover lapsed donors. And on the PM podcast, you can hear my conversation with CNN hero Peyton McGriff, founder of She. You can find all that and more on the website of our sponsor, DonorSearch, and on the DonorSearch YouTube channel. So until next time, take care and do good. We'll look forward to seeing you soon.